Wonderful, and welcome. Thank you everyone for coming, and welcome today to the IELT, it's a bit confusing, isn't it? The IELT webinar that is being sponsored today by IELTS, the IELTS USA, so we want to thank our sponsor very much. And I am going to just get started. So we're talking today about rubric design, and I'm going to get started with a poll to start everyone out. So I'm going to launch this poll right now. And I'd like everyone to there are 4 questions. If you can just answer those. All right, has everyone answered? Anyone that needs more time? Okay, I'm sharing these, so I hope you can see this. Do you feel comfortable using rubrics? And 3 people said yes, and 2 people said no. Said somewhat. Do you feel comfortable designing rubrics? 2 people said yes, and 3 people said somewhat. Do you feel comfortable teaching others how to design? And almost everyone said somewhat. 1 person said no. And are you in favor? Wonderful. So I'm speaking to the right crowd here, because I know so everyone said yes, they are absolutely in favor of using rubrics. That's wonderful to hear, because I know there's still some kind of hesitation about rubric use among some people. So let's go ahead. So the idea today is I want to quickly go through rubric design, how you might be able to design your own rubric. So everyone here is saying basically most people are saying they feel comfortable or somewhat comfortable using them. Let's go on and talk about how they're designed. I don't want to spend too much time doing that, but some amount of time doing that. And then I really want to spend time in a discussion, which will come in the second half of our webinar. So let's go ahead and talk about why we use rubrics. What are the advantages of using rubrics? And by the way, if you have any comments, questions, just feel free to just shout it out. So I don't want to make this too much like a lecture. I do want to spend some time sort of giving out information, but I hope by the end of this, everyone will be able to say, yes, I feel comfortable designing rubrics, and maybe even some people can say, I would feel comfortable going back to my workplace situation and teaching others how to design rubrics. So, all of us are already in that camp of saying we do believe in rubrics. So let's just look at some of the advantages of using rubrics. And again, if you want to add something, question, comment, just please shout it out. Rubrics add validity to assessment because the descriptors provide construct definition. Rubrics also add reliability to scoring, both intra-rater and inter-rater reliability. So intra-rater, let's just remember that means that if I'm rating a bunch of papers myself, say, I'll have more reliability. I'll be more consistent in my own rating if I'm using a rubric than if I just sort of gave my impression of each paper as I went along. And also inter-rater reliability. If I'm sharing the chore of rating, speaking, or writing with someone else, our interpretation or our scores would probably be more similar if we used a rubric. Helps teachers see the whole picture. That's something I'll talk about more later. But essentially, I might be a grammarian, and really, if I rate papers, I might focus on grammar and not worry too much if students are, if their essays are not well organized. Whereas Marla, I'm just going to pick on Marla here. Marla might be the one that says, well, I don't care too much if their grammar is absolutely correct, but I really want to see good content and good organization. And if Marla and I rated the same stack of papers, the students might get really different grades, right? Depending on if I just happen to rate it or if Marla just happened to rate it. And we don't really want to see that, because the writing itself should receive a score or a grade. It shouldn't be the writing plus the bias of the rater. So When we use rubrics and we allow ourselves to see the whole picture and not, in my example, just the grammar, or in Marla's example, just the organization, we're giving a fairer score because we're rating the whole production and not just those parts that we care about more. Rubrics also add transparency, especially if you, well, not especially, but if you share the rubrics with students, they add transparency because students know exactly what they're being rated on. They provide a clear basis for feedback. It's something if you have student-teacher conferences about their writing performance or maybe about their speaking, it's just such a good help as a basis for giving feedback. And through using the same rubric, which is something we'll talk about later, by using the same rubric over time, it even allows students to chart their progress by seeing how they've managed to move along in their development of their writing or speaking skill. Okay, any comments or questions about that? Let's go ahead. And I hope everyone knows the difference between analytic and holistic rubrics. Analytic rubrics have more than one category to rate on. Holistic rubrics we rate on a single category. And I want to spend most of the time today talking about analytic rubrics and maybe at the end come back to holistic rubrics. Analytic rubrics are better for classroom use. And as I just said, of course, they have different categories for measurement. They're better for classroom use, especially if we're rating speaking or writing formatively. So if we're giving feedback to students and we're trying to allow them to develop their skills. Different students in the same class who might be at the same quote unquote level might show very different strengths and weaknesses. So someone who's in an intermediate level, one person might have a very strong vocabulary and maybe good organization. I'm thinking here about writing, but if it's speaking, they might have good pronunciation and good vocabulary, but they might be weak in grammar or fluency, whereas the other student might be just the opposite. So it's not enough to say that if a student is at say an upper intermediate level, a group of students at an upper intermediate level all share the same traits. They may have very different traits which get them to that upper intermediate level. So by using an analytic rubric where we break down the descriptors into categories, we're able to give much better feedback. So that's really good for formative evaluation. I'm just looking here on you can see on your, everyone's seeing my PowerPoint, I hope, right? Yeah, okay, great. Of course, there are different ways to categorize these things. The ones I'm sharing here are the Cambridge ELT categories, which are based on the CEFR. ETS has slightly different categories, but I'm just going to use these. For writing, very standard categories would be coherence and development, organization and cohesion, structure and lexis. Or another way to look at that is when we think about coherence and development, we might be thinking about the whole paper. When we think about organization and cohesion, we might be looking at paragraphs and anything larger than a sentence and how those connect to each other. Structure, of course, is grammar. It's looking at the level of the sentence, and lexis is vocabulary. It's looking at the level of the word. And for speaking, these standard Cambridge ELT categories would be fluency and coherence, lexis, structure, and pronunciation. Okay. Any comments, questions about that? And I will make this PowerPoint available afterwards. All right, let's keep moving. Here is this is an example of a teacher-made. So this is not a Cambridge ELT rubric, but it's a very standard, very normal teacher-made rubric. And I think everyone here is already familiar with rubrics, but let's just go over some of the features of this rubric and try to understand what it is that's making this rubric so much better than just if we just impression marked. And also what's making this example of an analytic rubric better than a holistic rubric for marking in class work. So first, we see these different categories, and I've just sort of copied the Cambridge one. So fluency, this is a speaking rubric, obviously. Fluency and communication, vocabulary, oral grammar, and pronunciation. These categories, of course, just create an analytic scoring guide, and they're the basis of our construct. So this is giving us a complete construct, or I don't know if you would agree that this is complete, but it's relatively complete as to what the speaking skill really is. So when we are analyzing, or when we're evaluating a student as he's taking, as he's giving you a language sample to evaluate, we're not just simply focusing, as some people may, just focusing on the pronunciation and not really paying attention to anything else, or just focusing on their oral grammar, which would be, which wouldn't be fair because it's not looking at the whole construct. So this is really giving us a broader view. The descriptors are not, this is not, we're using rubrics, it's not a situation where we take 1 point off for every error, and the descriptors are not written in that way. The descriptors identify linguistic performance, and they're based on can-do statements. So we're not looking at what errors the student made and what the student got wrong in order to sort of take points off. What we're doing is we're looking at what the student is able to produce. So this has a very positive outlook, looking for the strengths of the student, and not any kind of error. And another thing on that point is that we want to think about the student's total performance, and we want to think about the range of performance and their attempt to use language, and not only at error and what they maybe didn't do correctly. Because for every error that a student makes, he's made it through a production of language, and we should give some credit for that. So that's why we want to really base these descriptors on can-do statements. And when we filled in all of these descriptors, we have a complete construct definition here at all levels. Now, some sort of advanced tricks. We see at level 1 here, which equates to, this would be a failing score. These bolded texts, like message cannot be conveyed, or vocabulary is not sufficient to express an opinion or tell a story, or not a single sentence correct. These are sort of limits. So in other words, if these bolded statements occur, then we're not going to go above. So this is a kind of ceiling, actually, and we're not going to go above a 1, or that translates to 55%. No matter what other aspects we might see, no matter what other aspects of performance we might see in fluency or vocabulary, etc. If they cannot manage to meet these ceilings, then their score is limited to that level. You see the scores here are based on letter grades, right? So there's a 95, which is an A, 85, which is a B, 75, 65, and 55. And I've had in my own teaching and workplace situation, I've had discussions about why we don't go all the way down to a 0. But my feeling is this: when the students are being, in my situation, and probably similar in most of your situations, students are being given a grade somewhere between an A and an F. And an F represents, so essentially we don't really have a scale from 0 to 100. We've got a scale from basically 55 to 100. So why would we have descriptors for things that are below F? It doesn't make sense to me. I think anyone who shows up and attempts a writing or a speaking should earn at least an F. And that's maybe my bias, and I don't know if anyone feels differently. But I think, and if you do, please say so now. But my feeling is that anyone who makes an honest attempt should earn at least an F. Anyone want to make a comment about that? Or this has been in my workplace a very sticky point, actually. So, all right.
I'd say I agree with that. I like that because, yeah, if somebody doesn't show up at all, that's different than coming. And even if the effort is limited, it's still effort. And yeah, that is a difference between, not being there at all versus showing up and giving some of themselves, I think.
Yeah, absolutely. And what, in the end, if you've got this terrible student who just doesn't deserve to pass, what are you going to give him? You're going to give him an F. There's, at least where I teach, there's nothing less than an F. So why not just award them an F, right? And I think the other thing, there's a very practical issue here too, is that if you give them a score like 30 or 20, this performance that you gave me today was so bad, you deserve a 30 or a 20, that's going to have a knock-on effect to other scores. So when you're averaging out their classroom, their all their grades in a whole session or semester or whatever, whatever your situation is, that single bad performance might be enough to drag their average down, where let's say all their other performances were good. Then if all their other performances were good enough, then they should pass. They shouldn't be dragged down by a single low performance. And that's another reason why I think giving them an F is probably, that's as low as we can go. If you want to refine this a bit, and I've done this in my own teaching situation, is you can add half steps. So in other words, let's just imagine that I'm rating a speaking performance by a student on vocabulary, and I just look at this. Descriptor here, and I say, yeah, that's pretty much what he was able to do, but I think he went a little more. I think he really went a little farther than that. But then I look at this performance, this descriptor, and I say, it wasn't really there yet. So I might give an 80. I might be able to give between this 3 and a 4, 3.5, which is going to translate to an 80. So that's like a way to just refine the scoring a little bit. And of course, in the end, we average the 4 scores to come up with a total score. And then one more advanced tip, ceilings are also possible. So you do have the examples here of ceilings at the lower level, right, at the F level, that if they don't perform beyond this, like if every sentence has some sort of grammar error, or if their pronunciation is so poor that only part of the message is coming through, we don't really understand the message because of pronunciation, we're going to limit that to a score of 55, no matter what else they might do in that category. You could add in these same sorts of ceilings, not only at the lowest level, but at any level you wanted. So you could say, if this, for example, if the student didn't write a multi-paragraph essay, then they're not, if they just sort of blurred everything into one long paragraph, I'm changing the example here to writing, then they might not get above a C on their organization if they weren't able to. So that would, that C level, that 75. That's just a possibility, right? I mean, you could think of anything you wanted, and as you're constructing rubrics, you could add them in anywhere you wanted, these ceilings that say that this is sort of a must do. And if you didn't do this, no matter what else you did well in that category, you're not going to go above a C or whatever level you think would be the right one. Okay. Any comments, questions about that, constructing, or actually we haven't gotten to construction yet, but just what a rubric is doing and why it's doing all of these things. Okay. Let's go on then to just look at a few more points about analytic rubrics. Descriptors themselves do not assess. So the descriptors are what was in each of those little boxes, right? The descriptors themselves do not assess. They simply describe. The assessment comes when we match a student performance to the descriptors. And that's really what we need to do. And I think that's sometimes, for people a bit less familiar with rubrics, and probably none of you are in that place, but I think sometimes people use these as checklists, and they feel like they have to go through each and every one of these descriptors and be able to say yes to each and every one of those descriptors. And that creates some confusion when people might start saying, well, it's not really, it's not really this one, but it's not really this one either. And I think the answer to that is simply to say that what we're looking for is a best fit. It's not necessarily, we don't want to turn a rubric into a checklist, but we're just saying, what is the best fit? Which of those descriptors is a best fit? And we can usually match a set of descriptors to a student performance if we just consider that it's a best fit. Again, teachers do not give grades, so I think there's that sort of inability on. It's certainly in my workplace situation. there's that inability on the part of some, not all, but some teachers to just let go. And because they still feel like, I want to give this a C, I want to give this a D. And it's usually something low. It's usually not something high. This is where the conflict has come in. But rubrics reveal the score or the grade. We teachers, we set up the rubric and then we kind of let go, right? I think that's really very important. We have already made a decision when we wrote the descriptors. And then at that point, we have to let go. And we have to use the rubric and match the student's performance to the descriptors and allow the rubric to do its magic, to do its work, and reveal the grade. And I've had some teachers say, but this essay doesn't deserve this grade. And they just feel that, they know what they're doing. And I looked at this, I used the rubric that you gave me. I scored it the way you wanted me to, and I just don't think that this essay really deserves this grade. So I have two answers to that. One is, well, maybe the descriptors are off. Maybe the descriptors aren't doing their job, or maybe they're misaligned with scores. And maybe through the use of the rubric, you want to rewrite the descriptors. That's a possibility. But I think there's another possibility, which is probably more likely. And that is that a lot of teachers tend to look at the weakest points of the essay. So, and again, I'm just using, it could be a speaking performance too, but I'm just looking, let's just talk about an essay here. So again, if I'm the grammarian and I see a lot of bad grammar in an essay and I want to fail that, oh, this is terrible, there's all this bad grammar, right? But what about the content? What about the coherence? What about the organization? What about the cohesion? What about the vocabulary? I might overlook those things and only want to just fail it because it doesn't have a lot of good grammar. There are a lot of grammar errors. And that's really what I want to sort of hit the student with. Well, I'm not saying that paper deserves an A, but maybe it doesn't deserve an F either. And maybe if I'm the hardcore grammarian, I'm overlooking the successful aspects of the writing by concentrating on that one thing that just bugs me about that paper, right? And that's because it bugs me. That's not really a fair way to assign a grade to a student. So if he's got good content, good organization, good vocabulary, and not doing so well on grammar, maybe that paper deserves a B- or a C even, if it's really not that good. But maybe it doesn't deserve an F. And I think that's really the answer to that question of, but this essay doesn't deserve this grade. Right. Again, any questions or comments, just please shout out. If not, I'm going to go ahead. Anyone want to make any comments at this point? This is such a good audience. Either you agree with me completely, or you're overwhelmed, or I don't know what. These points have been so contentious in my own teaching situation, as I've tried to introduce a universal concept of rubric to all of our teachers. Okay, so let's talk about, some of you said, well, I feel good using rubric. I don't really feel so good designing one. Let's talk about how to build your own analytic rubric. And the first thing is that you need to get out a pencil and draw some boxes. That's where we're going to get started. So if we see on my PowerPoint here, I've got a bunch of boxes. And the second thing I'm going to do is I'm going to decide on my categories. And I'm going to go back to those Cambridge ELT categories. This is a writing rubric. So I'm going to talk about content and development, organization and cohesion, structure, vocabulary. So quick quiz for everyone. What's one thing on here that is missing that I haven't included that one other category that you might want to stick on there? I didn't include it, but can you think of another category?
Mechanics.
Perfect. Yes, mechanics. What about punctuation, those capitalization, those kinds of things? I chose not to include it here, but you might want to throw mechanics on there too. And you can weight these. I don't think anyone would say, well, maybe you would. I wouldn't say that mechanics are as important as, say, content, right? Especially when in upper level writing. Mechanics can be easily fixed with a little editing, right? Content, I believe that's more important. So we could weight these. We don't have to make them all equal. In my example here, I've made them all equal, but you might want to give mechanics only 5% or something. Or maybe you feel Maybe Yubai feels like really strong about mechanics and she wants to give it more. I don't know. That's up to you. But let's decide on our categories. And once we've decided on these categories, let's assign scores. And again, we talked about this already. I really believe in that A through F scoring concept. That's up to you, how you design your rubrics. Once we've done that, we need to start filling in our descriptors. And my feeling is that we should start, and if everyone is familiar with this idea of a cut score, and this is a pretty important concept, actually, the concept of the cut score, because I think we often think when, let's say that you're teaching, I don't know if everyone here is a teacher. I asked you all where you're coming from. I didn't really ask you what you're doing, but I'm going to assume that if you're not a teacher, you're at least working with teachers. You know, if I'm teaching upper intermediate, I have this sort of, and almost all of us, we have this gut reaction that I want the good students, right? And some of the students come to my class from the next level down, and they're just really not up to my expectation. And I say, you know, these students shouldn't have passed. Send them back to the lower level, right? But the fact is, and I know that's so easy for us all to do, right? But the fact is, some of these students that I want to send back to the lower level are the least performing past students. They didn't fail, but they were the least performing past students. And that's the idea of the cut score. What is the lowest you can be and still pass, right? And I think that's where these descriptors, I think that's how we should approach these descriptors. We don't want to talk about what our perfect, amazing student that, you know, we only get one of them every year or so. We don't want to fill in those kinds of descriptors because then everyone's going to do poorly, right? Think about your lowest performing student that you would give a C to, and what are the descriptors that you would assign to that lowest performing student? And again, my feeling, what I like to do is I like to start with C because it's sort of the pass-fail borderline, at least in my teaching situation. So I like to start with filling in those descriptors for a C level student. Now, there are two ways to do this. The quick way is to do it from your own head, or a better way would be to meet with colleagues and design it together. The best way to do it, and in many of our situations we just don't have time for this, is to take samples of student papers that you can agree on. So you actually collect data from the students, and then you sort of find the papers that you could say, these, you know, you and 3 colleagues who are all teaching in the same level, you say, these are the papers that are really C. We all agree these are C papers. And then look at the papers and try to define from the actual performance what the descriptors of content would be, what the descriptors of organization would be, what the descriptors of structures would be. So that's a very data-driven way to fill in these descriptors. But a lot of us don't have time, or we have to write the rubric before we meet our students, et cetera, et cetera. So if you're an experienced professional teacher, you can also do this from your own head. So once we get these filled in, let's go ahead and fill in the other categories. And I like to cheat a little bit and give myself a kind of basic descriptor to help me. So if my C level, which I've already filled in, is level appropriate or standard, it's sort of, you know, average, for lack of a better word, then an A might be an outstanding essay, and a B might be a strong essay. A D, I'm going to call the threshold essay. It's just on the borderline. It's not really what I'm looking for, but it's not a complete fail. An F, I'm going to call the failing essay. So now I've got an idea, and I'm going to say, what is my, now that I have my C level filled in, what is my outstanding essay? And the way I would do it is to fill in that A descriptor next, and then the F descriptor. And then after that, I might want to go back and kind of meet in the middle. Once I get my A levels filled in, go back and meet in the middle. What does a B look like? And it's probably something between an A and a C. The same thing for the D, the threshold essay. What does that look like? Well, it's probably something between a C and an F. And one more point, and this is, you know, probably stating the obvious, but of course you want your descriptors to all be parallel, right? whatever language you've used in the C, you're going to look at those same traits, those same attributes in the B and the A and the D and the F. So there's kind of a sliding scale of similar attributes. Okay. Any questions or comments at this point? Okay, so this is just an example of a completely filled in rubric. And if you'll get this, we won't spend time now, but you'll get this in a PowerPoint, and you can see the how these descriptors just work through the descriptors work through the same traits, but each one adds on to the last one. And you see some bold here, which again are those are ceilings, right? So for example, here, complex sentences are regularly attempted. So though with frequent errors. So if we don't see complex sentences used regularly, we're not going to go higher than a C, no matter what other aspects of grammar we might see, right? And here's this bold or this ceiling, complex sentences predominate. So we want to see mostly complex sentences. And if we don't, we're not going to go we need to see that, or else we can't give the B grade. All right. Now, for those of you, and again, I'm really talking to the wrong group of people here, but for those of you, and maybe you can use this as ammunition against some of your colleagues if you need it. Some people are still going to argue against rubrics, and let's just look at some of the arguments against and what we could sort of come back with, the arguments for. I already know my students. I know what I'm looking for without using a rubric, right? Using a rubric makes grading more transparent. It makes feedback easier. Of course, you're sharing, if this is formative evaluation, you're sharing the rubric with your student. It makes feedback easier because you have a common set of criteria to talk about. And even if you know what you're looking for, so that argument, I already know what I'm looking for, right? Your students may not. So making that what you're looking for transparent is really a good argument for a rubric. It's too hard to read and figure out all these categories. It takes too much time. Maybe if you're new to rubrics, that may be true in the beginning, but once you familiarize yourself with the descriptors, it becomes fast. I find it's often faster and easier to use a rubric than not to use a rubric, because if you don't, you have to go back and sort of start from scratch every time and figure out what you're looking for. The descriptors don't match what my students actually produce. Again, are you using the rubric as a checklist, or are you using it in a best fit approach? And I suggest a best fit approach. And if this is really a recurring problem, then maybe the descriptors need some updating to make them match better what your students are actually producing. Okay. Again, we talked about this already. The scores that I get with the rubric don't seem right to me. Remember, the rubrics reveal scores. Teachers no longer give scores. If you feel that you're losing all your, if you're giving away all your power, remember, you created the rubric in the first place. That's where your power lies, right? You made it, and now you're allowing the rubric to do its magic. Again, you may be unfairly assessing problems without giving credit for achievement. And again, if it's a recurring problem, then change the scoring system. If it's always giving you scores that just really don't seem right, maybe you need to update the scoring system. I was doing fine before. Why should I change? Well, this is the way that, that teaching is going. It's actually, rubrics have been in popular use since at least the 1990s. It's more reliable and valid. And again, it's more transparent. It gives students an idea of exactly what they're being marked on. Okay. Now, that was the end of my presentation, and now I'd like to turn it over. I want to hear you and your ideas. Advantages and disadvantages of holistic and analytic rubrics. Anyone want to start talking about that?
Could you go over what a holistic rubric is?
Sure. So yeah,
sorry,
absolutely. So we looked at an analytic rubric which had different categories. A holistic rubric would take all the descriptors. There would be only one category. right? So instead of dividing out, grammar, vocabulary, cohesion, et cetera, we would just have one general category where all the descriptors fit into one category.
It certainly doesn't. Oh, sorry.
Go ahead. Go ahead.
Okay. It certainly doesn't let you give an accurate picture of the people that you mentioned who might be good at one thing but not so good at something else.
Right.
Yeah.
Right. I agree with you. If you're going to give feedback,
holistic,
you want to give feedback on the strengths, and the rubric an analytic rubric reveals strengths as well as weaknesses. So I like to start with strengths in my feedback. So
Anyone else? Advantages and disadvantages?
I think one advantage of using a holistic rubric is that it gives the entire picture. And also I think it fits the style. Like for me, I'm like to take a view from a holistic view. So the analytic rubric kind of gives me like I feel it breaks down what the students can present, and it doesn't give me a whole picture.
Okay, yes, so if that, absolutely, so if that's your approach, that you just approach their production from a holistic perspective, then if that's your approach, then absolutely you want to assess that in the same way, right? You don't want to say, I'm a holistic thinker myself, I approach your work from a holistic perspective, and then all of a sudden assess them in a very different way, right? Yeah, absolutely.
Right.
Absolutely.
I agree on the analytic aspect of that. You can say someone has a lot of strengths, but one area is very low, pronunciation, for example, but everything else is really good. That may not happen a lot, but you can't, I don't think they would, in the holistic scale, they would not be able to be at a higher level because they don't, that one area takes them down. And from a diagnostic perspective or a teaching perspective, it's much better to know, okay, this one is really strong in this area, but not in that area. And I can, I feel you can put it all together for a picture of what the whole level of competence is still. For example, I don't know, I would love to hear a justification for ACTFL. I don't use ACTFL because I'm not that in the foreign language, but I look at those descriptors and I go, I don't really know. I've not been trained. I'll say that. I do not know what this really means for me with those students.
Right. I can answer that, but I'm going to wait till the end, actually.
Okay.
Any other comments?
As far as using holistic or analytic, I think it also depends on your students and what level you're using them, especially if you're going to share the rubric with them. I work with teachers primarily in West Africa and India, and I give them the rubrics. And if I use a holistic rubric, I would have a hard time writing something that would make sense for them. And because I need them to absorb it in order to know exactly what I'm looking for, what they need to do. So I think it depends also on who your audience is.
One comment I can make on that, because that's a really interesting point. And rubrics, of course, are filled with a lot of ESLEs, right? I mean, we tend to write them in that way because we know what they mean. I have seen situations where there is a student version of the rubric. So we have a teacher version with all the jargon, and then if you're good at paraphrasing to get it to the point where your students can understand it easily, to actually have two versions of the rubric, one that's better for teachers because we rely on jargon a lot, right? And I mean, complex, just one example, it's complex sentences might mean more to me than to students, maybe not, but in your situation, maybe your students wouldn't understand that, but teachers would. So if you can write a student version, that can help in that case.
Okay.
And if you can do that, why not just use the student version for yourself too? I mean,
yes.
Then everybody's looking at the same
Mm-hmm.
same description.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
I think we ran into that situation my previous institution, and we did come up with I guess we didn't invent the idea by any means, but we did make a easier version for the students. But I think for like accreditation, that sort of thing, we felt like we had to have the other version that was more for the professionals. But in practice, the one that mattered the most definitely was for the instructors or the teachers to use with the students, because the students did get to understand what each of those meant without having to teach the complex vocabulary that wasn't necessary really for their future.
Mhm.
Yep.
Any other comments? I just want to answer Jim's question then. So when should we use a holistic rubric? And he mentioned the ACTFL, and ACTFL uses a holistic rubric, and I think I'm more familiar with IELTS than TOEFL, but I think TOEFL uses a holistic rubric for speaking and an analytic rubric for writing, but I might have that reversed, or I might have that entirely wrong. But anyway, holistic rubrics are sometimes considered quicker to use because you don't have to sort of make a decision on each category. So if you have lots of students to get through, like large numbers of students, for example, on an intake exam, where the exact categories don't really matter, because no matter what, on a placement exam, no matter what they did well or what they did not so well, they're going into the same level anyway, right? So the one who's strong in grammar, weak in pronunciation, and vice versa are going to end up in the same place. So why sort that out? And the other thing is, maybe for final, again, if you have large numbers of students and you're giving final exams when they'll never get feedback, then it's just quicker and easier to use a holistic rubric. But when it comes to really analyzing, and like Yubai said, if you're a holistic thinker, then it makes more sense if that's just the way you approach your students. But again, if you're giving feedback, you want to decide a grade based on their overall performance in sort of in-class essays and speaking productions, probably makes more sense to use, for most of us, to use an analytic rubric. Okay. Next question, and again, I want to hear everyone. Should I focus on task-related descriptors, or linguistic descriptors? So should I design, does everyone understand what this question means?
Yes,
Mm-hmm.
I do. And that is a point of contention in my situation.
Let's hear about it. I'd be happy to hear about that.
Yes, we are working with teachers in India, and we're teaching them how to teach new approaches to teach reading. But they're also, my evaluators, what they like to see is better English from the teachers themselves, because they're second language speakers or third, fourth language speakers. And I am more concerned with the task, because that is what we are training them in, saying we need them to be able to teach the kids how to read with better approaches. So, and they said, but they won't be able to do it if the English is not solid. And so here we are fighting how to do this. That is where we are stuck. And we haven't finished our descriptors, because I want them heavily on the task and they want it heavy on the linguistic.
This is teacher training, right?
Yes, teacher training.
Yeah. So you're not actually evaluating language. I mean, some apparently some people want you to do more of that, but you're not actually evaluating language performance, right?
We are, in a way, because the education department wants us to. Mm-hmm. But to me, it's more important that, to me, through the task, I think the teachers will improve the language that is weak. But for others, if the language is not strong enough from the beginning, the task won't get done. But yes, we are responsible for both the task and the linguistic aspects to the education department, because salaries and promotions depend on both.
Right. Other comments? Has this been a problem in any of your work environments, or an issue? So one of the, I'll just give you a little more information. One of the issues. So I was recently involved in a project to make sure that all classes at all levels in my teaching situation. So I'll give you some background. So I'm a teacher. First and foremost, I'm a teacher. I'm also the head of the assessment committee, and so I have to do this, other kinds of things. And one of the issues that we recently dealt with in the past, say, 2 years or so, is ensuring that all classes at all levels used rubrics for productive tasks. And a big debate that came out of that is, should we have task-based rubrics, or should we have linguistic-based rubrics?
Could you maybe give an example of how those two would be different?
Right. So the linguistic-based rubrics would ask, going back. Well, all the examples. So I'm very much on the side. Yeah, you're going to get a very biased answer here, because I'm very much on the side of linguistic descriptors, and all the examples I gave you are of linguistic descriptors. But another side of the coin would be, can you write a business letter, for example? Can you answer someone's questions when he comes to the front desk? Can you mediate in a situation where a speaker of your language can't express himself in English and he needs to? I mean, those would all be examples of tasks, and we could also create descriptors for how well a certain student completed those tasks if we have a task-based curriculum.
But I think in those examples, you can incorporate the linguistic, and answering a question correctly necessitates the linguistic aspect of it. It's not just completing the tasks for the sake of completing it, but completing it correctly and furthering the communication aspect. And you cannot do it without the linguistic.
Right. So would you even include the task, or would you not? Would you just say that the language is the language no matter what the task, and we can apply the language to different tasks? Or
all those are valid.
Okay.
So, yes.
Anyone else?
I think I would err towards the linguistic, but I do think you can somewhat incorporate both task aspects and the linguistics. For example, in our international teaching assistant testing, we have to do language pronunciation, language being vocabulary and lexis and grammar, and then pronunciation is a very big factor, intelligibility, obviously, for teaching. And then discourse includes both fluency and we do include a rating on the teaching and the effectiveness, including ways around if you don't know the words, and using the board and using all that, but we're not fundamentally rating them on their teaching per se. The language comes first, because we could be heavily criticized if we say, well, you didn't teach well, but then a native speaker might teach worse. And we're not about that. We're not supposed to be, rating them for their teaching, but we do want to make sure they're able to do it in a way that's understood by our students.
Mm-hmm.
So I think that's still a task. I mean, the task is teaching in this case, but we're focused on the linguistic capabilities. I don't know if that makes sense, but.
No, absolutely. And I'll tell you what happened in my situation is finally, so I would be the one that says, let's use just the linguistic descriptors, which can be applied to any task. I kind of answering Letty's point. That's the thing I said, and that's sort of how I feel. Then other people felt very opposed, and what we finally agreed is that the rubric, and I think I'm going to give away at least my idea on the next question of this, but what we finally agreed is that the rubric will not change. The rubric will have linguistic descriptors, but there will be one blank category, one category left blank. The teachers can fill in for every different task. That's sort of the compromise we came to. And yeah, let's go ahead and, that's the next question is, should I have a different rubric for each assignment, or one rubric that I use for all main assignments, all major assignments? So again,
Sure. Oh,
please.
Yeah, it'll sure make your life easier if you use the same one over and over.
Yeah.
Practicality, right? Yeah,
Mhm.
absolutely. Anybody else?
Yeah, if you have different rubrics for each assignment, you may overwhelm the students for all the descriptors that you have, and you will overwhelm yourself with all the feedback you have to give.
Mm-hmm.
So perhaps doing a very good, solid rubric that includes, I mean, you can tweak it as you go along or increase it, but I wouldn't have 5 to start with.
Well, and
I
that would
would tell
be
my
a,
students,
sorry.
I would tell my students that as we master these areas, the complexity or the difficulty will increase. But so I wouldn't use the same rubric at the beginning of the semester that at the end. That I don't do. But I increase the difficulty in some descriptors and some
Okay.
I don't touch.
Okay. Jim?
Oh, well, I was just going to say, I think that would be maybe an argument for linguistic focus more than a task focus, because if there's still linguistic elements in all of the things you're doing, hopefully, and that would be able to be used the same rubric. I would err on the side of one rubric that works linguistically at most. Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, these are all issues that, we're not going to settle here, and everyone's always going to have their own opinion. But, I mean, going back to Letty and her point, I just want to say that, I feel that if you write those descriptors generally enough that you could use them, and I don't know, obviously I don't know your situation, but I think rather than increasing the difficulty of the descriptors on the rubric, another way to accomplish the same thing is by increasing the difficulty or the complexity of the task. And if those rubric descriptors are general enough that they can accommodate easier tasks and more complex tasks, then you can even use the same rubric throughout your course. But that's just one, I'm not saying that, yeah, but I'm not saying that what you're saying is wrong either, right? It's just an approach, and it's,
yeah, but it makes sense. I hadn't thought about that. Yeah, I will explore that with
well, it's up to you. I mean, obviously,
it's another approach worth looking at.
Let's go on. So I think the last question we'll have time for. What about checklists? So checklists, as we know, are kind of alternatives to rubrics. And this, I just included an example here of a checklist. And this one, rather than giving a score like 95, 85, 75, we're simply giving a check or an X in my case. You've done this or you haven't done it, right? Or I would also use question marks if they've only partially done it, or they've done it in some places or not others, or it's not exactly clear. How about checklists versus rubrics? Should I what's better, or when to use which one, etc.?
I use the checklist for students' self-assessment.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, and for formative assessment, as opposed to something where you have to give a grade on an important essay or something.
Mm-hmm. Any other? Sorry.
Oh, I was going to say, in some ways, I think this for students, this in addition to a rubric, a checklist may give students more feedback that they could use, but that might be more work for for teachers, instructors, professors in the class to fill this out too, or give it a check or something like that. But I think it does help students. It's a little bit more defined, but I would probably use check. I don't feel like using checklists for an exam necessarily. I'd prefer the rubric in that situation, but for an assignment perhaps, or in conjunction with a rubric to help.
Yeah, I use self-assessment, but also for feedback. I usually give the checklist as a feedback, like you should have this and this. Yeah.
Yeah, and this, it seems to me this is more task specific and better for classroom use than the rubric. In our case, we use it for actually large scale testing. I don't think this would be a relevant for that purpose. We're trying to place people.
Right.
Yeah.
Yeah. I tend to use these checks. So this is actually one of my checklists. And if you see any spelling errors or things that aren't quite right, that's because I use it very informally. I use this usually for, obviously this is for writing. I use it to give feedback on drafts.
Mhm.
And I use it, as Eric said, I use it in combination with a rubric, but I wouldn't use this to actually assign a grade. I would use it more, as Letty said, as a kind of a self-assessment, or it could be self-assessment, or I might collect the papers and I would go over these, and then I would meet with the students, something like this. To give sort of formative feedback, but again, not to give a grade. All right. Any last comments? I think we're just about out of time. It was wonderful that I could see everyone here. I want to thank you for coming, and I want to thank ELTSUSA for sponsoring this webinar. That's my email if you want to send me any comments. I hope I've stimulated you to think a bit more about using rubrics and maybe teaching others about creating and using rubrics. And next month, our webinar is on alternative assessments and what's new in assessment. So if you want to join us, we'll be here. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Very, very enlightening. Thank you. Bye-bye.
Thanks.